They didn't ignore you because you were weak. They ignored you because you were safe. You smiled first. You forgave quickly. You explained everything. And in a world ruled by wolves that made you easy to calculate and easier to dismiss. It started early. Maybe in school where the louder kids got attention and you got overlooked. At work, you showed up on time, played fair, followed the rules, while someone louder, bolder, more erratic got the promotion you deserved. Even in love, you gave everything too soon. You texted first. You cared visibly. You apologized even when you weren't wrong. And still, they pulled away. Not because you weren't enough, but because you showed too much too early. You weren't unreadable. You were obvious. And what's obvious becomes disposable. You thought kindness was your strength, but in their eyes it was a green light to push your boundaries. Because the predictable can't threaten. The emotionally accessible can't intimidate. And if they know exactly how you'll respond, they'll never hesitate to cross the line. But now, that version of you is gone. No more explanations, no more chasing. You speak slower, you reveal less, you watch more, because power doesn't come from being understood. It comes from being unreadable. They don't need to know what you'll do. They just need to wonder if you will. Mystery is power. Goodness is expendable. You were taught to be good. Smile when spoken to. Be approachable. Give the benefit of the doubt. You believed that if you were good enough, kind enough, open enough, people would value you. But they didn't. They took advantage not because you were bad at boundaries, but because you had no edge. You were light in a world that respects shadow. The truth is, goodness doesn't command respect. Mystery does. People don't fear what they understand. They fear what they can't explain. You tried to be likable, harmless, transparent. But in their eyes, that made you safe to test. Because what's visible is predictable, and what's predictable can be controlled. They knew how you'd react. You'd be polite. You'd forgive. You'd stay. So they pushed. They talked over you. They made jokes at your expense, and the more you tried to be kind, the more disposable you became. But that ends here. Now you speak with restraint. You show only fragments. You don't reveal your full thoughts, because power isn't in how much they like you. It's in how much they second-guess themselves around you. They hesitate now not because you've changed, but because they can't define you anymore. You don't have to be feared for what you do. You just have to be feared for what they think you're capable of. That's the difference. You were trained to be seen. Now you'll be remembered for what they never got to see. And that silence will echo louder than anything your kindness ever did. Presence is louder than words. You were told to speak up if you wanted to be heard, but the louder you spoke, the more invisible you became. Because in a world drowning in noise, the one who says less becomes the one they listen to the longest. Let me ask you, how many times have you explained yourself thinking it would bring you clarity? But it only brought you dismissal. How many arguments have you lost, not because you were wrong, but because you overtalked, overjustified, and they stopped hearing you the moment they figured you out? You thought your voice was your power, but power doesn't come from how much you say. It comes from how much they feel when you say nothing. Look around you. The person who dominates the room isn't always the loudest. It's the one whose silence bends the energy, the one whose glance shifts the dynamic, the one whose presence lingers after they've left. You want to be that person? Then stop trying to convince. Stop needing to be understood. Start letting your restraint speak louder than your desperation. Because when they don't know what you're thinking, they start adjusting their behavior. When you don't react, they start questioning their own. They watch you not out of admiration, but out of calculation. Is he testing me? Is she offended? What will he do next? You don't answer. You let the question hang. That tension becomes your power. Most people want attention, but you're not most people. You want respect. And respect comes from being unreadable. Not mysterious for effect, but strategic in presence. There's nothing more terrifying than a person who doesn't need to prove anything because it means they already know their value. And that kind of silence, it doesn't fade. It haunts. You don't need to raise your voice to be remembered. You just need to control the space between your words and let the weight of your stillness do what your speeches never could. You become a threat when you stop explaining. They only started listening when you stopped talking. That's the irony. When you explained yourself, they dismissed you. When you justified your feelings, they questioned your strength. When you begged to be understood, they stopped taking you seriously. Because in their mind, the more you explain, the more control they have. They didn't hear your truth. They heard your need. And once they know you need to be heard, they weaponize that silence. They ignore you, delay replies, cut you off mid-sentence because they know you'll come back with more words, more softness, more proof. You thought words built bridges, but in power dynamics, words expose leverage. The person who explains too much reveals too much, and what's revealed can be used. So you shift, you stop explaining, you let people wonder, you speak with presence, not apology. Now when someone criticizes you, you say nothing. When they question your silence, you nod. When they bait you with disrespect, you blink slowly and walk away. That's when they feel it. They start asking what you meant, why you didn't react, what you're thinking, because suddenly you're not emotionally available on command. You've become a mirror and they're left staring into their own discomfort. A man who explains is manageable. A man who doesn't becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is fear in disguise. You don't have to shout. You don't have to strike. You just have to master the one thing most people can't: emotional silence. Because the person who doesn't flinch, doesn't chase, doesn't defend, is the one they start preparing for. Not out of love, not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. And that is the highest form of respect, not when they believe you're right, but when they fear what happens if they cross your line again. Withhold to control. Scarcity builds obsession. You gave too much, and they got used to it. Your presence, your time, your availability. You thought it would make them appreciate you, but it only made you common. They didn't pull away because you weren't good enough. They pulled away because you were always there. Predictable, immediate, familiar. And in human psychology, what's familiar becomes invisible. You were the constant, the one who always replied, always forgave, always showed up even when they didn't ask. And because of that, they never had to earn you. You became background noise in a world addicted to novelty. But here's the truth no one tells you. People don't chase what they fully understand. They chase what's slightly out of reach. They obsess over what felt close, then vanished. They replay what was never fully finished. That's why silence hits harder than begging. That's why disappearing echoes longer than explaining. Because now they feel the absence. Now your missing energy becomes a mirror. Suddenly they ask, why haven't you called? Was it something I said? Did I push too far? They'll never say it out loud, but they feel it in the unease, the silence, the lack of closure. And the more they think, the deeper your presence embeds itself in their mind. That's power, not attention, not noise, but the lingering after effect of your withdrawal. You don't punish, you don't react, you vanish strategically quietly, and your absence becomes a loop they can't close. The most unforgettable people are not the ones who scream the loudest. They're the ones who say little, give less, and disappear before they're fully understood. So next time you want to be remembered, don't give more. Give less. Let the unfinished sentence, the unreturned call, the missing goodbye do the work for you. Use inconsistency to create unpredictability. They don't fear who you are. They fear who you might become. And the moment they can predict you, they stop respecting you. You've been taught to be consistent, to be stable, reliable, emotionally available. But in reality, predictability breeds entitlement. The more they understand you, the more they manage you. They know your tone, your triggers, your timing. And once you become emotionally routine, you become emotionally weak. That's where you flip the script. You smile in conversation, then go silent for days. You show warmth, then withdraw with no explanation. Not to play games, but to fracture their certainty. Because nothing creates tension like contradiction. And tension is the birthplace of control. People fear instability, not chaos, but emotional contradiction. A kind voice today, a cold glance tomorrow. Praise now, distance later. Why? Because when your pattern breaks, they become alert. They lean in. They question. They start recalibrating. Now you control the rhythm. They chase your consistency because you've made it scarce. That's not manipulation. That's strategy. The world trains you to be likable. But likability is disposable. Mystery is magnetic. Let them overthink you. Let them wonder where they stand. Because once you become hard to predict, you become hard to replace. The goal isn't to be loved on command. It's to be feared in silence, not because you're cruel, but because you no longer fit into their expectations. And when people can't place you, they place you higher. Stay calm while others break down. They'll scream to be heard. They'll gossip to feel powerful. They'll panic insult-provoke because chaos gives them a false sense of control. But not you. You don't flinch. You don't raise your voice. You simply blink. Slowly. And in that moment you win, because nothing is more unnerving than someone who stays calm while the world around them loses composure. Think back. How many times did your silence bother them, more than your words ever could? How many times did staying still make them spiral? That's not weakness, that's control. And control, especially emotional control, is the highest form of power in any interaction. Most people rely on noise. They perform outrage. They fake urgency. They raise their voice, hoping to drown you in emotion. But when you don't match their energy, you interrupt their script. They expect conflict. You give them composure. They expect reaction. You offer restraint. They push harder, and you stay still. That's how you dominate without confrontation. Because emotional neutrality doesn't mean you don't care. It means you're in command of when, where, and if your emotions are ever shown. You're not avoiding the fight. You've already calculated that winning doesn't require it. This is where you become dangerous, not by striking, but by refusing to be shaken. Your calmness becomes unsettling. Your stillness becomes a threat. Now they hesitate. They second-guess their insults. They lower their tone. Why? Because your lack of reaction makes them fear what reaction might look like. That's how you shift the dynamic, not by being louder, but by being heavier psychologically. You're not just present. You become a force they orbit around, carefully. Because when others lose control and you stay composed, they don't see silence. They see a storm you haven't unleashed yet. Presence is louder than words. They told you to speak up, to raise your hand, to voice your worth, but every time you did, you felt it, that subtle dismissal. That moment when they stopped listening, the second you tried to prove yourself. You were taught to use words to gain power, but in the real world, power doesn't come from noise, it comes from presence. And the one who says the least is often the one who controls the room. You don't need to fight to be heard. You need to become the one they anticipate before you speak. Because when you're silent, but heavy, unreadable, they start calculating around you. Think about it. The people you remember most didn't overwhelm the space. They mastered it. They walked in calm, detached, untouchable. And suddenly the energy shifted, not because of volume, but because of command. That's the shift you're about to make. No more over-explaining. No more performing for approval. You'll be the one who walks in without needing the spotlight because you've already altered the atmosphere by entering. This is the psychology they never taught you. When you say nothing, people project everything. They wonder what you're thinking. They overanalyze your silence. And in doing so, they elevate your presence. You've been chasing validation when you should have been cultivating tension. From now on, say less. Blink slower. Pause longer. Let your restraint force them to adjust. And when you leave a gap they can't close, because power isn't found in how loudly they hear you. It's in how long they feel you after you're gone. Stillness isn't weakness. It's precision. It's psychological pressure. It's the silence that makes them afraid of what you're capable of, even if you never raise your voice. And that is presence, not attention, but gravity. Control the narrative without speaking. They can't stop talking about you, but not because you said anything. That's the trick. You didn't explain. You didn't clarify. You didn't correct the lie. You just nodded and let them fill in the blanks. And that's what terrifies them. Not what you said, but what they think you meant. Because silence isn't absence. It's strategy. The moment you stop trying to be understood, you start becoming interpreted. And interpretation is where power lives. Let them assume. Let them whisper. Let them analyze the look you gave the message. You didn't reply to the sudden shift in your tone. They'll write stories in their heads far more intense than anything you could have said. And those stories, they linger. They spread. They reshape the way people see you without you lifting a finger. That's the power of controlled invisibility. Because when you're silent, you're not neutral. You're unreadable. And unreadable people live rent-free in everyone's head. Think about it. How many people have you obsessed over just because they never gave you closure? Just because they didn't give you an answer? That's psychological tension. That's how you dominate without conflict. You let their curiosity do the work. Their confusion becomes your shadow. And your silence, that becomes the weapon they can't disarm. So stop correcting every rumor. Stop chasing explanations. Stop handing over emotional access every time someone misunderstands you. Instead, weaponize their projections. Let them invent who you are. Because in a world addicted to attention, the one who refuses to explain becomes the one they can't forget. They want answers. You give silence. And that silence becomes a mirror reflecting their own uncertainty back at them. You don't need to control the room. You just need to control the story they tell when you leave it. Build rituals of psychological power. They trained you to be polite, to answer immediately, to explain yourself, to be available. And every time you followed those rules, you gave away power inch by inch. Not because you were weak, but because you didn't know your silence was worth more than your words. That ends now. Power isn't something you demand. It's something you ritualize. It lives in your pauses, your stillness, your timing. Want them to respect you. Stop being predictable. From now on, don't react first. Let them speak. Let them reveal. Let them fumble for your attention while you observe in silence, because the one who reacts first is always at a disadvantage. But the one who waits, that's the one who owns the room. Speak slower. Say less. Leave earlier. Those aren't quirks. They're weapons. They tell the world you're not seeking to be understood. You're forcing interpretation. They'll leave conversations thinking, what did he mean by that? Good. Let them wonder. Let the silence echo louder than any answer. Withdraw strategically. Disappear from rooms before your presence becomes routine. Stop replying in ways they expect, because the dog is always there. But the wolf appears, then vanishes, and when he's gone, they feel it. Never explain your moves, say no, and let it be final. Change your mind and give no reason. Walk away and stay gone. Every time you justify yourself, you're asking for permission, and power never asks. You don't need louder words, you need sharper patterns. Daily rituals that signal, I don't need your validation. I am the consequence you forgot to prepare for. And when those rituals become your default, you'll no longer chase influence, you'll radiate it. Train people to respect your absence. They only noticed your worth when you stopped showing up. It wasn't the messages you sent, it was the silence that followed when you didn't. It wasn't the hours you gave, it was the moment you vanished without warning, without explanation. That's when they felt it. Because people don't value consistency, they exploit it. But they fear absence, especially when it comes from someone they thought they had access to forever. You used to overextend, always available, always present, always explaining. And they got used to that version of you, the version who stayed even when disrespected, the version who replied even when ignored. But that version is gone now. You've learned something most never do. Presence means nothing until it's taken away. So now you weaponize your absence. You stop responding. You leave early. You exit without closure. And suddenly, they reflect, not because you yelled, but because you left quietly. Now they replay your silence. They overthink your distance. They whisper things they never said when you were still in the room. That's when power shifts, not when they hear your voice, but when they feel your disappearance. You don't need to slam doors. You just need to let them close without explanation. You don't need to warn them you're leaving. You simply stop arriving. That's how you train them, not through anger, but through detachment. When your presence had weight, your silence becomes unbearable. Let your absence be the mirror. Let them sit with the space you used to fill. And next time, they'll tread lighter, not because you asked, but because you disappeared before they believed you would. Never beg to be respected. Become the loss they didn't see coming. And from that point forward, you'll no longer need to demand value. You'll embody it. Balance fear with respect. Not one without the other. You've spent your whole life trying to be respected. You spoke carefully. You showed your value. You led with kindness. And still, they interrupted you. They expected more than they gave. They liked you, but they never feared losing you. Because respect without fear breeds entitlement. And fear without respect breeds rebellion. Get that wrong, and you become either disposable or resented. You were told to be respected by being competent, calm, helpful. But people don't respect what they think they can control. They respect what they can't predict. So here's the truth. The most powerful people aren't the ones who are feared or respected. They are both. Because when they enter a room, people adjust. Not out of admiration, but out of caution. That's the shift. You're not here to be liked. You're here to be watched. Closely. Carefully. Because now they don't know how far you'll go. And that mystery, that tension is what keeps them from crossing you. You don't have to raise your voice. You don't need to threaten. You only need to make them feel what could happen if they test you. Fear without respect. They'll fake loyalty and plot behind your back. Respect without fear, they'll praise you publicly and use you privately. But fear layered with respect, that's a different kind of power. It's quiet. It's psychological. It keeps people alert, polite, measured, not because you demanded it, but because your energy told them he could destroy me, but hasn't. That's the balance. Cold enough to hold boundaries, calm enough to avoid chaos, but sharp enough that they remember you're not someone to test twice. So stop choosing between fear and respect. Become the reason they pause before speaking. The silence they think about after you leave. That's not intimidation. That's command. People don't obsess over what they understand. They obsess over what they almost had, but couldn't define. And that's the version of you they can't stop thinking about. It wasn't your kindness that made them come back. It was your silence after they expected closure. It was the unanswered message, the unspoken goodbye, the look that said everything and nothing. Because obsession doesn't grow in clarity. It grows in confusion. And you were trained to be clear, to explain, to end things properly, to give people the clean exits they never gave you. But now you know better. From now on, you leave slightly earlier. You respond slightly less. You disappear slightly before they're ready. Why? Because the human mind hates unfinished business. And you, when delivered in fragments, become a story they'll replay 100 times, trying to fill the gaps, trying to finish what you never confirmed. You don't give them certainty, you give them tension. And that tension, quiet, cold, unresolved, becomes addictive. They'll ask themselves, was that the last time? Did I do something wrong? Is he done with me, or just watching? And every time they replay it, you gain more space in their mind than you ever had in the room. You're no longer the one chasing connection. You're the one they can't close the file on. That's psychological warfare, not through cruelty, but through intentional incompleteness. You don't need to be unforgettable. You just need to never finish the sentence. Because when people can't finish the story, they don't move on. They circle back, again and again. So give them something to obsess over, not your presence, but your absence wrapped in mystery. And watch how the unfinished version of you becomes louder in their memory than any full explanation ever could. They want to know what drives you, what scares you, what keeps you up at night. Not because they care, but because they know that once they understand your why, they can control your how. That's why you stay silent, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Because the moment someone gains access to your inner world, they start building maps, and maps become leverage. So now you protect your thoughts like a fortress. Not everyone gets a key. Not everyone deserves one. When they ask what you want, you say, "That depends." When they ask what you feel, you say, "Still figuring that out." When they press for answers, you smile and change the subject. It's not about hiding. It's about staying unreadable, because power doesn't come from how well you explain yourself. It comes from how little you need to. They should never feel like they've fully understood you. They should feel like they're always almost there, but never quite close enough. That's where obsession begins. And more importantly, that's where control lives. Mystery isn't created by silence alone. It's created by emotional privacy. You don't owe the world your backstory. You don't need to narrate your healing. Let them guess your motives. Let them debate your intentions. And while they're busy doing that, you're already 5 moves ahead. Because the man who speaks less doesn't think less, he's just protecting what matters most. Your inner world is your kingdom. Every time you let the wrong person inside, they rearrange the furniture. So lock the doors, dim the lights, let them knock. And when they realize they'll never fully know you, they'll stop trying to manage you and start respecting the fortress they can't enter. You thought power meant being the loudest in the room, the one with the final word, the commanding tone, the visible authority. But the truth is colder and sharper. The most powerful person isn't the one everyone hears. It's the one they still feel after they've left. Presence isn't volume. It's weight. It's what makes people rethink their tone the next time they speak to you. It's what lingers in the silence after you walk away. You've met people like that. They didn't say much. They didn't overshare. They didn't try to impress. But something about them stayed with you long after they disappeared. That's not charisma. That's design. Powerful people engineer memory. They don't flood you with words. They drop one sentence and vanish. They leave the conversation before it ends. They leave the room before they're expected to. And that unfinished energy becomes a loop in your mind. You replay it. You overthink it. And they gain ground without ever needing to return. Most people rush to be seen. They crave attention, but attention fades. Presence echoes. From now on, stop trying to dominate moments. Instead, haunt them. Speak calmly, then go silent. Say less, but say it surgically. End the sentence before they feel closure. And walk away, not with drama, but with certainty. That's how power stays in the room after your body leaves it. That's how your energy continues shaping conversations you're no longer part of. You don't need to take control. You just need them to wonder what you would have done next. And when they don't have that answer, they start treating you like the variable they can't afford to miscalculate. That's not intimidation. That's command through absence. In a world addicted to noise, the person who controls their silence controls the room. You don't need to yell to be powerful. You don't need to over-explain to be respected. The people who are remembered long after the conversation ends are the ones who speak with precision and walk away with intention. The lesson is simple, but brutal. Stop making yourself too accessible. You don't need to give people your full emotional landscape just because they ask. Let them wonder. Let them earn proximity. When you withdraw strategically, your absence becomes your message. And that message is louder than any argument I don't need to perform to have value. In everyday life, this means pausing before reacting, speaking slowly, leaving before your energy is drained, saying no without apology. Letting your silence create tension, not out of cruelty, but control. Because power isn't about dominating others. It's about managing your presence so tightly that people feel the shift when it's no longer there. Be calm. Be unreadable. Be the person they replay in their head long after you've left the room. That's how you stop being liked and start being respected.